How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. One of my first builds in the Wild Imaginary West involved a stagecoach and this bison-headed monster. This was my second attempt at this 3D printed monster, because the first one was left with a large hole and a flat area on its back due to a printing error. The theme for this month's art challenge was a house you don't trick-or-treat at. I didn't want this misfit resin monster to go to waste, so naturally, I built a house and put it on his back. The first thing to do is to get this hairy bad boy glued down to a base. I have a lot of offcuts from previous builds, so I had no problem finding a perfectly sized base in my woodpile. In order to get him to hold tightly to the base, I drilled some holes in his feet using a pin vise. I had to be quite careful while doing this because cured resin is rather brittle and cracks easily without much force. Once those holes were drilled, I glued in some metal rods. I drilled some complementary holes in the base to match the locations of the pins in the monster's feet. I then pushed the pins into the base and I used some super glue to secure the monster in place permanently. Next, it was time to build a foundation for the house that would sit on the monster's back. I used some wooden walls from a 1:72 scale battlefield accessory pack. I trimmed up some pieces to get them to the right size. I flame treated the surface of the plastic off camera to get the super glue to adhere. I used super glue because of the differing materials that I would be gluing together. Once I had the main base on, I wrapped some chains around the monster's arms, and the goal was for it to look like he was carrying the house on his back, like a house backpack. After all the chains were glued on, I added some supports protruding up and away from the monster's body. I then added some crossbars and I covered up all of my nice plastic wood with some wooden wood. I then made some wooden walls with more balsa wood. I gave them some scratches and weathering using a wire brush. Wire brushes could also be called little needle brushes because they will definitely poke you and make you bleed if you're not careful. Once I had all the walls done, I glued them together and I made a turret for a front corner of the house. I also added a slightly larger overhang to go on that same corner underneath the turret. I then began adding little details here and there, like awnings and trim pieces, as well as a frame to go on the roof. I then added some boards across the frame on the roof to fill it in. I also covered up some unsightly seams on the corners with some corner trim. I cut a piece of XPS foam into a little conical roof to go on top of the turret, and then I glued that in place with some foam-safe superglue. If I used the normal stuff, it would just melt. I did use the normal stuff to glue the house down to the platform, and then I turned the awnings on the first floor into porticos by adding some supports. Also added a wraparound porch, and then I cut up a plastic sandbox strainer toy to make some windows and doors. After I had glued all of the windows and the doors onto the house, I added some railings to the first floor around the porch. Because this is the Wild Imaginary West, I wanted to have some antennas on this house. I drilled some holes with my pin vise. I assembled some antennas off camera using these bits and pieces from K&S Precision Metals. I've bought a number of these little packs at my local hobby store. They have always come in handy. I'd recommend you pick up a pack if you ever see it. After I had glued the antennas in place, I also glued on a little chimney. I wanted this house to have some chains hanging down, but I didn't want them to be able to swing around freely, so I used some super thin super glue to super stick these super chains in place. I also added some gutters around the edges of the roof, some corrugated metal to the roof itself, and a few more details like broken beams and boards hanging down from the foundation of the house, as well as some broken pipes to suggest that this thing had kind of been ripped out of the ground. After all of the construction and detailing had been done on the house, I brushed some stuff out of the way and it was time to add the wet ingredients. I covered the little foam roof with some Mod Podge, and then I moved on to the terrain. I mixed up some Mod Podge, Sculptamold, water, and sand into a nice textured terrain paste, and I smeared it all over the wooden base. I also glued down some pre-made plaster rocks, and I left it to dry. After it had dried, it was time to take the monster and his little house backpack outside to prime. I primed the model black, and then I broke out the airbrush and began applying a zenithal highlight, starting first with a medium gray sprayed at an angle, followed by a layer of white sprayed directly from above. I decided to paint the house yellow because that's a color I rarely use in my videos, and I felt like it was the right color for this house. I splotched it on a little messily to help sell the idea that this was an old country farmhouse that had been uprooted and stolen by a roaming plains bison monster. I painted all of the trim with a coat of white. I painted all of the unpainted wooden surfaces with a dark brown. And I painted the roof with a wet blended combo of brown and blue. I then applied some ink washes and I dry brushed a dusty color over all of the wooden surfaces and all the other surfaces as well. I then moved over to the monster. I gave it a coat of thinned down bison brown, which is not a real color, and I painted its back with orange brown bison back, which is also not a real color. I then used a combination of wet blended washes on the surface of the ground. I made those rocks just a little bit more saturated. Everything kind of toned down when it was dry. I dry brushed the rocks, and I tied the whole piece together with a light dusting of some tan from the airbrush. I then livened up the base with some tufts of dead grass. I sprinkled on some additional life in the form of dead leaves. I had forgotten to paint the bison's eyes, so I went back and I painted those black, as well as some broken windows. The last thing to do was to paint the wooden sides of the base with black 3.0, and after that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to appreciate these art pieces submitted by my patrons. Thanks again to all the patrons who participated in that this month. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Huge shout out as always to all of my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.